everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh. We have a great episode of Uprising for you today because we are going to be talking about the P word. What is the P word? Well, it's a word that you've probably heard, especially in the Trump era, being used in some frankly questionable contexts. We're going to take you through its origins with one of the help of the foremost experts on all things of this word, Thomas Frank. That's right. We're going to be talking about populism, and we're going to be going through an excerpt from Thomas Frank's amazing new book about the history of populism, The People Know. And that's a comma for the know, which is spelled as with an N, not a K-N-O-W. So very, very interesting narrative, and one that you don't often hear, right? Because a big thing that we know about populism is it's the reason behind Trump. It's the reason behind the Tea Party. It's for white, racist, reactionary movements that serve to just do no good in the world, and they're just crazy demagogues and ideologues and people who don't even know what they're doing. And the people, like the people's movements, have been really stretched. Like the Tea Party, for example, was characterized as a populist movement, a movement that sprung out the way the people did, and of course that movement was literally in large part started by business journalist CNBC's Rick Santelli and the Koch brothers, and all those people. I think he was the one who said the word Tea Party first, and this guy probably, you wouldn't consider him as a man of the people. Neither I don't know anyone who would. I especially wouldn't know anyone who considered Charles and David Koch one of the biggest bankrollers of this Tea Party wave, quote unquote populists who really care about what's best for the people. No, this is really what we've seen here is a just complete bastardization of the word populism in a way that is designed to create a lot of distrust among the kind of upper middle class and kind of people in the professional setting, but not quite elite level of these kind of mass people-led movements. And to answer the real question correctly, what is populism? We go to Thomas Frank. He writes, populism was the first of America's great economic uprisings, a roar of outrage from people in the lower half of the country's social order. It was a quintessential mass movement in which rank-and-file Americans came to think of the country's inequitable system as a thing they might change by common effort. Pretty much the whole basis of what we're trying to do in this current moment, right? We see a massive problem with both parties. Both sides of our political system are incredibly diseased and ineffective, and a lot of Americans know that, and they feel that very deeply, but something is missing to get this end result, to get this, and the key is really to figure out what it is to figure out how to get this big group of people to come together and to say, we could actually change things and make a better world if we act together, if we act as one, to pursue a common goal, to achieve a common purpose. And that is really what people like William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement did here. So it really was a glimpse of how citizens of a democracy born with faith in equality can sometimes react when the brutal hierarchy of conventional arrangements is no longer tolerable to them. Populism was our country's first and really only serious third-party effort. Actually, that's not entirely true. There was a few earlier. But it was our country's most recent, that's for sure. It was the last one to stand a decent chance of breaking the duopoly of the Republicans and the Democrats. In the 1890s, the two main party systems were still basically regional organizations. Relics from the Civil War, as populism transcended that system by making an appeal based on class solidarity, aiming to bring together farmers from the South and West with factory workers in the northern cities. Because if you remember that time, farmers were around half of the population of the country. And they pretty much had to pay more and more debt each year because the value of money was tied to gold. So it would kind of deflate every year. The value would go up in terms of the value of the dollar each year. And what we had in that time was more than half the population like struggling to pay their bills, struggling to in any way keep a sustainable, dignified life, because all they do is borrow, all they do is get into more debt, and there really was no program there to help them. And meanwhile, in the North and in these big industrial centers, workers were more exploited than ever. In the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, before we get all this kind of mass movement and organizing, they were really in an incredibly rough situation. If you've gone through any kind of social studies class, you probably heard about the conditions, right, in the factories, the child labor, the Upton Sinclair, the jungle, all that kind of stuff. Those things were what they were all dealing with at the time. And they started to see, the farmers and the factory workers kind of started to see themselves as two separate groups, to be sure, but groups of people that had some common interest. And the interest of this is pretty much what it sums up. The Omaha platform of the People's Party in 1892 proclaimed the interest of rural and civic labor are the same, and their enemies are identical. So, like, in another name, this really was almost the first, like, socialist, quote unquote, movement that we've seen in this country. Like, really identifying that there are groups of people who may seem somewhat alienated, but have these same kind of like class needs and class enemies, and people were stopping them from getting their way. What the pops, as they were called at the time, meant by this is those who prosper while producing nothing: bankers, railroad barons, commodity traders, along with their hirelings, these corrupt politicians who serve wealth instead of the people, had to go. This was, of course, a time of unregulated corporate monopolies, of in-your-face corruption, and of crushing currency deflation. And it was also a time when everyone agreed that the government's role was to provide a framework conducive to business and get out of the way. It was really a time of extreme laissez-faire capitalism. And it was really a time when, especially late in the game, really before we, I can say we, as I consider myself to be a populist, pretty much got everything, the populace at the time, at least, they got everything they wanted in the New Deal. But before that, there was a president who thought the best way to do, to help people was, again, even in the middle of a Great Depression, was to stand back and do absolutely nothing. Just say, oh, yep, businesses will figure it out by themselves. It won't be a problem. Like that is, it'll work itself out. There won't be anything to worry about. Because, yeah, businesses know best. So what really was at this time, this formal ideal, the execution was a little uglier than the kind of let businesses do what they want. They can grow. They make this country what it is. It was really a matter of the smoke-filled rooms, exploitation of the factory floor, bankruptcy, foreclosure, and cabinet teeth for sale. And entire state legislatures brought with free-ride railroad passes. That's literally all it took. Go up to state legislature and say, you want to go ride on the big choo-choo train? And they give you a free U.S. senator if you're rich enough. So this is the backdrop that the populist revolt began to take shape. The rightful subject of the government's administrations, populism insisted, was not business at all, but the people. Government should think of the people first, not businesses first. Screw Adam Smith, screw his invisible hand. Let's get to it. It all began in the 1880s when farmers started signing up by the thousands for a cooperative movement called the Farmers Alliance. America was still largely an agricultural nation, and the places where populism eventually took root, farmers made up overwhelming majorities of the population. The problem was they were not particularly affluent majorities, however. In the South, farmers tend to be desperately poor, borrowing against future crops to buy food and necessities. The merchants from whom they borrowed took pains to ensure not only the farmers never got out of debt, but they took the merchants' dictation on what to grow and how to grow it. So pretty much a form of sharecropping that continued even for some white farmers in the wake of the Civil War. So it really was a just completely suffocating and oppressive situation. And what to grow pretty much always turned out to be cotton, and as the southern farmers produced the crop, after bumper of crop after a bumper of crop of cotton, just churning it out by the bumper load, the price, of course, only sank. So they were not able to pay their debt, and they were just kind of on a hamster wheel and never able to get out. Farmers in the West, meanwhile, find themselves at the mercy of a different set of middlemen, local railroad monopolies and far-off commodity speculators. Like their brethren in the South, they worked and borrowed and grew and harvested. They watched as what they produced was sold in Chicago and New York for good prices, and yet what they themselves earned for their labors fell and fell. In 1870, farmers received 43 cents a bushel for corn. 20 years later in eastern Kansas, it was sold for 10 cents a bushel, far less than what it cost to grow. Accounts from their period describe corn lying around the ground with no takers, corn burned in stoves for heat. It was a really rough time, and they just couldn't do anything about it. There was no source of relief in sight. To such people, the Farmers Alliance made a simple proposition. Let's find out why we are being ruined, and let's get together, and let's do something about it. Because, after all, people still had faith that this was America. And if they had problems, they could get together and organize and vote in a group and do something about it. And education pretty much was the first order of business, and the movement conceived of itself of sort of a national university employing an army of traveling lecturers. Chapters of the movement ran lending libraries, radical rural newspapers, of which there are many, sold cheap books about agriculture and political reform. So an incredibly effective method of just like getting people aware of the situation, which something I would argue could be taken note of in the current period, because I know we have Twitter and we have kind of this like insular online community people who are very much aware of all the problems. But, and don't get me wrong, average Americans are definitely aware of all the problems that exist in today's day and age. But what we do see is no will, and this is probably the scarier part, we don't really see any will or any belief that something can be done about it by any of these people. So that injection, that spark, will be the key, to be sure. So by the end of the 1880s, the Farmers Alliance had millions of members, mainly in the South, and the Colored Farmers Alliance, of course, the Southern alliances were segregated, a sad reminder of the Jim Crow America that we lived in, represented about 1 million more farmers. Similar farm groups in northern state brought additional millions into the radical fold. News reports marveled at the enormous audiences that would turn out to hear Alliance speakers, crowds of the size typically found at modern-day football games gathering in a pasture somewhere. A novel published at the time describes the way American minds began to change. People commenced to think who had never thought before. People talked who had seldom spoken. Little by little, they commenced to theorize upon their condition. Despite the poverty of the country, the books of Henry George, Edward Bellamy, and other economic writers were bought to be read greedily and nourished by the fascination and novelty and zeal of enthusiasm. Thoughts and theories sprouted like weeds after a May shower. They discussed income tax and single tax. They talked of government ownership and the abolition of private property, fiat money, and the unity of labor. 1,000 conflicting theories. These people were, first and foremost, this is the real key. This is the thing that was happening here. They were starting to become educated, and they were starting to know things about the economic lay of the land. They were really starting to see, hey, yeah, there's been a bit of a problem. There's been a bit of a problem here. We're really getting kind of screwed. And I don't know what we can do about it, but let's read. Let's find out. First of all, let's get understand what's happening to us. Understand what other people think about economics, and like this unprecedented learning that was happening. This mass education that was happening at such a grassroots and like shoestring level, but so widespread because so many people were in such misery and so many people were suffering. And the point that this got to, I think, is something that if you're looking to kind of repeat the conditions of some sort of mass education and mass movement here, it can really not be understated because things were really, really bad. So, at first, the political program of the Farmers Alliance focused on a handful of big issues: the regulation of railroads, federal loans to farmers, and a currency reform of a kind that would help debtors. And, of course, that's the big thing there, fiat money.